Some people seem cold, distant, hard to love, but in truth they are merely striving not to be wounded again. Pain alters the very manner of a person's existence. And the most lamentable part is that scarcely anyone takes note. As I have often observed, when pain is not comprehended, it retreats into the shadows of the psyche and becomes mere behavior. I shall endeavor here to illuminate the conduct of those who have endured profound suffering, to unveil the reasons behind their actions, and most crucially, to demonstrate how that unconscious suffering may be transmuted into true awareness. I urge you to attend closely to these reflections, for they may grant you a vision of yourself, less laden with guilt and a gaze upon others richer in compassion. A number of individuals are not cold. They are fortified. Others are not difficult to love. They have simply been taught to distrust affection. Certain behaviors which the world designates as distant, intractable, or complicated are in fact but the means by which the psyche attempts to survive that which caused excessive injury. When suffering finds no room for genuine feeling, it hardens into a defense. And these defenses may over time appear to be an inseparable part of our very being. Yet they are not. They are but armor silently woven stitch by painful stitch with the thread of emotional self-preservation. I have often maintained that pain is the very currency with which the soul purchases greater consciousness. I do not seek to romanticize hardship, but to view it as an integral facet of the soul's expansion. Deep suffering, when approached with reverence, has the capacity to reveal not merely where we are injured, but where we have forgotten to live in our entirety. It is thus that great suffering forges behaviors that stem not from mere temperament, but from the ego's desperate struggle to maintain the functionality of the soul, even when buried beneath the ruins of experience. Those who have suffered profoundly develop psychological mechanisms of great complexity. Mechanisms often imperceptible even to themselves. Their manner of reacting, relating, protecting themselves, or retiring from the world is not capricious. It is structured within the deepest strata of the unconscious, constructed to prevent the resurgence of the initial wound. To judge these actions is akin to observing a scar and utterly disregarding the injury that preceded it. But there is a greater perspective, a gaze which asks not what is wrong with you, but rather what grievous thing transpired to you. This is the vantage point from which one begins to transform suffering into insight, seeing in all behavior a clue, a cryptic cipher, a map. For the psyche speaks through emblems, through repetition, through emotional constellations. Every reaction which appears exaggerated may well be but the echo of an ancient sorrow crying out for recognition. The wounded soul does not desire pity. It yearns only to be seen. And the granting of such empathetic sight is the initial step by which the ego may cease its automatic reactions and finally commence true listening. When we grasp that pain shapes us yet does not define us, we may then begin gently to loosen the fastenings of that armor which had become indistinguishable from our very skin. In the place of that rigid shell, a space emerges fragile, to be sure, but nonetheless real, wherein awareness may begin to minister to that which previously knew only to defend itself. Some sorrows do not vanish. They merely reorganize themselves within our breast. And when these are not received, they become living nuclei that continue to respond to a threat that has long since departed. I have termed these phenomena complexes unconscious emotional arrangements possessing a psychic life of their own. They are not inherently malicious entities, but rather defense systems. The soul erected to withstand severe blows which the ego could not withstand alone. Consider the man who endured deep rejection as a child. This need not be an overt event. Sometimes it is merely silence, emotional absence, or an eloquent glance. That unassimilated emotional trauma evolves into a rejection complex. In later years, this person may react vehemently to any perception of distance, a curt reply, a delayed communication, a neutral expression on another's countenance. It is not that they are overreacting. It is the complex which reacts, the wound which speaks once more with the original intensity. As I have stated, all men possess complexes. The profound difficulty arises when they possess us. When a complex is activated, it seizes command of our awareness. The individual is plunged into an emotional state which he often cannot himself fathom. He may weep without apparent cause, erupt in disproportionate anger, suddenly retreat entirely, or experience a desolate emptiness over an incident of trivial nature. These behaviors are not irrational. They possess an internal logic within the emotional structure of one who has endured excessive sorrow. It is a frequent occurrence that those who have suffered greatly spent years believing themselves to be overly complicated, excessively sensitive, or too reactive. Yet the truth is that these complexes function as alarms which are instantly triggered when the unconscious perceives that something in the present moment resonates with a pattern from the past. Even if the conscious mind fails to forge the immediate connection, these emotional nuclei do not dissipate through sheer force of will. They shift their nature when they are acknowledged. The true process commences with a form of inner hearing. What within me demands care at this very moment? From whence does this reaction truly spring? What precious thing does this pain seek to safeguard? Awareness does not obliterate the complex, but it divests it of its mute authority. Complexes are not failings. They are emotional memories. When we learn to listen to them without the paralysis of fear or condemnation, their shouting ceases. They begin to whisper. And in that faint utterance, the soul commences its rearrangement, not to erase what has occurred, but to establish an inner sanctum where the suffering no longer reacts autonomously, but finally begins to be cared for. Distrust is not frigidity. It is self-preservation. For the individual who was harmed in the very realm where he sought his greatest safety, the act of reposing trust is no simple gesture. It is an immeasurable risk, a peril which the ego in its ceaseless vigilance learns assiduously to avoid. Thus, even when faced with circumstances that appear benign, the soul remains in a state of alert. For the unconscious cannot differentiate between the present reality and the events of the past. It merely identifies the emotional motive and reacts. This perpetual state of vigilance is an adaptation forged in response to a world that at a crucial juncture ceased to feel secure. This may arise from an act of betrayal, a ruptured bond, a vital emotional absence. The concern is not the magnitude of the external event, but the psychic impact it imposed. Once distrust takes root, the ego erects subtle defenses, scrutinizing every gaze, dissecting silences, preempting disappointment before it manifests. If signs of danger are not immediately discernible, the ego will often conjure them all to prevent being caught unawares once more. Those who inhabit this condition do not desire to live so, but they fear even more profoundly to experience again the intensity of that initial wounding. Distrust evolves into a filter through which the words of the other, their intentions, their expressions, and even their affections must pass. Everything is measured, weighed, subjected to trial, and frequently undermined, for believing can feel far more perilous than pushing the other away. I have taught that the psyche operates from a principle of protection, not malice. The ego distrusts because it has learned that the price of faith is exorbitant. Yet, as time progresses, this very protection exacts its own toll. The inability to attain authentic intimacy. For no man can truly commune with another while constantly awaiting injury. Healing commences when we discern that our reactions are addressed to the past, not the present. When we recognize that the terror is not immediate, but an emotional resonance that still vibrates within. It requires great fortitude to quiet that internal alarm even for a fleeting moment. And to pose the question, is this threat tangible, or am I being guided by a memory? To bestow trust does not require the instant dismantling of all defenses. It demands the allowance of minor emotional checks upon reality. It means acknowledging that the present may be wholly distinct from the past, and that the other is not accountable for the wounds inflicted by another hand. Distrust is not an error. It is a response. However, when the ego recognizes that the war has ceased, it may by slow degrees permit itself to rest. There are periods when the inner world seems to undergo a complete collapse. Confidence is shattered, attachments feel like jeopardy, and suffering appears to be the only loyal companion. In such periods, isolation is not an act of choice. It is primal instinct. The injured soul retracts much like a wounded creature recoiling from the slightest touch, not in a manipulative display, not out of pride, but because any emotional exposure feels too profoundly dangerous. Thus, it seals itself off, erecting unseen barriers, lapsing into silence. This retirement from the world is frequently misinterpreted by the external observer. They perceive coldness, detachment, distance. Yet from within it is clear that isolation is in its genesis a species of psychic chamber, a sanctuary where the soul attempts to reassemble itself after being rent under. It is there in the gloom that it strives to recall its own identity now that the world seems devoid of safety. I view this inward descent as a constituent part of the symbolic process of death and renewal. The shadow turns in upon itself, not because it has relinquished life, but because it requires protection until it can draw breath again. And silence is at times the only vernacular available to one who is still learning to name his sorrow. Yet that which commences as a haven may over time become a custody. That which was intended as a temporary sensation becomes a fixed pattern. That which was protection evolves into a chronic solitude, and the very thing that once saved now begins to asphyxiate. The soul grows accustomed to independence, and the heart, though it continues its beat, resides behind doors to which no one possesses the key. Awareness is the element that can shift this condition. There is no need for haste in the process, but there is an absolute necessity for truth. It is a matter of acknowledging, yes, I retreated to survive, and subsequently, but perhaps now I am no longer compelled to be perpetually alone. That inner acknowledgement begins to relax the rigidity of the defense, and isolation may gradually be transmuted into solitude. A viable space where aloneness no longer signifies utter disconnection. It is then that reconnection becomes possible, a reunion with one's own feelings, with fellow men, with the very fabric of life, not as before, but in a far more genuine fashion. For those who have withdrawn deeply are best equipped to know when it is finally safe to unlatch the door, if only just a little, one cautious step at a time. Some men present an appearance of being unflappable. They speak with conviction. They seem resolute. They walk as though they know their precise destination. However, beneath that collected exterior, there is frequently a history of deep pain, the suffering of one who learned prematurely that vulnerability was utterly unwelcomed. The psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott understood this mechanism well. He noted how children who were denied sufficient emotional containment would develop a false self, a veneer of protection that concealed their authentic nature born not of choice, but of harsh necessity. When weeping is met with deafness, the resulting instruction is the imperative of silence. In subsequent years, this dynamic solidifies into what I described as the persona, that social visage we all assume, but which for those who have suffered profoundly may become a prison clad in gold. That which was intended as an adaptation assumes the mantle of identity. The control that once afforded shelter now imposes confinement. And the persistent query that resonates is, who should I truly be if I were simply permitted to be? The persona itself is not the source of the melody. We all possess one. It serves to navigate the social realm, guard our private world, and adjust to varying circumstances. The profound difficulty begins when we cleave too closely to it, when the mask ceases to be a tool and starts to feel like our own skin. This is often the fate of those who have endured too much. Individuals who have lived through rejection, deep humiliation, or abandonment generally feel too exposed to reveal their innate fragility. They thus learn to perform strength, to maintain perpetual control, to convey the impression that no external force can touch them. But this projection is not the truth. It is merely the shield, a shield that is often polished, intelligent, and functional, yet profoundly solitary. For the greater the rigidity of the persona, the less accessible is the soul that resides behind it. This is the reason why wounded persons may sometimes be perceived as cold, detached, or even arrogant. They are none of these things. They are simply too vigilant to lower their ramparts. The ego learned that the display of emotion carries a grave cost, that excessive visibility invites danger. Thus it erected unseen bulwarks, rehearsed pronouncements, non-committal smiles, automatic responses, all mechanisms designed to keep the deepest pain locked away beyond the reach of others. Yet the persona is not invulnerable. It begins to fissure at that point where the soul can no longer tolerate its own concealment. When the sheer weight of loneliness becomes intolerable, when the internal silence begins to thunder louder than the external image, it is then that a subtle alteration commences. The central question is no longer how am I perceived, but rather who am I in reality. It is precisely there that healing takes root, not in the abolition of the persona, but in the diminishment of the compulsion to hide behind it. For genuine strength lies not in the appearance of invulnerability, but in the willingness to be seen even in the presence of abiding fear. Not all empathy springs from cognitive understanding. At times it is born of unassimilated pain. Those who have suffered deeply frequently cultivate an acute sensitivity to the sorrows of others. They are adept at discerning nuances, perceiving subtle emotions, and are moved easily. This may appear on the surface to be a virtue, and indeed it can be. Yet when that sympathy oversteps the boundaries of the self and becomes a means of escaping the self, it ceases to be presence and transmutes into projection. Often those who feel with too great an intensity for others are in fact feeling a profound sorrow for themselves. Though they fail to realize it, it is as if the suffering of the other serves as a mirror reflecting an unacknowledged wound within. Consequently, rather than descending into the depths of their own afflictions, they attempt to mend in others that which remains fractured within their own breast. This process is subtle, almost undetectable, but it occurs. They give too prodigiously. They ease their own needs. They invariably assume the role of the Sakura, and with the passage of time this function becomes their very identity. I am the one who understands. I am the one who manages all difficulties. I am the one who sustains others. But underlying this relentless self-giving, there is often an unconscious strategy to evade their own internal turmoil. For ministering to another feels far safer than confronting that which remains unresolved within. I assist in understanding this through the concept of projection. When we cannot contend with a particular aspect of ourselves, we externalize it. In the instance of excessive sympathy, we project a fragment of our own pain onto others. This does undoubtedly establish a connection, but it also exhausts us, for no relationship is sustainable when its foundation is imbalanced. This variety of unbridled sympathy is frequently attended by emotional depletion. The individual feels drained, fatigued, experiencing feelings beyond their rightful measure and nearly always without their knowledge. They construct relationships predicated on the exchange where they give and the other merely accepts. This is not genuine love. It is emotional codependency masquerading as deep sensitivity. Healing begins with a nuanced yet profound recognition. The understanding that feeling for others must not necessitate the oblivion of the self. That the truest listening to another's pain can only occur once one has learned to listen to one's own. And that offering aid does not require carrying the burden. It requires walking alongside with a conscious awareness of one's own limitations. Authentic empathy is born when one's own suffering has been inwardly acknowledged. It then becomes a steady presence, neither excessive nor salvific, merely available for those who have learned to tend to themselves, are capable of being whole for others without surrendering their own being in the process. This is the quality of sympathy that truly heals. Quiet, unassuming, and profoundly human. To offer love to one who has been deeply injured is never an easy deed. It is not an absence of desire. It is an excess of memory. Every attempt to open the heart carries the accumulated burden of all that once went airy. Even when the current partner is different, something deep inside maintains its defensive posture. Affection is met with armor. The bond takes shape but remains vigilant. This is love wearing a protective shield. This emotional prudence is frequently misinterpreted as coldness. Yet it signifies not a lack of feeling, but the consequence of a psyche that learned to safeguard what once bled too profusely. The terror resides not precisely in the other person, but in what that person might awaken: the old pang of abandonment, of renewed disappointment, of violated faith. Thus the heart approaches with profound circumspection, and the ego, like a battle-weary soldier, refuses to entirely abandon its guard. I have shown that relationships constitute the very theater in which complexes most intensely perform their drama. It is within intimacy that unintegrated wounds resurface. This explains why profoundly wounded persons often love with a portion of themselves withheld, perpetually keeping one foot outside the threshold, always prepared with a silent plan of retreat. This posture may appear protective, but by slow degrees it commences to destroy the true connection. For to achieve genuine communion, one must allow oneself to be vulnerable. And for that to occur, one must differentiate between what pertains to the present and what remains as the residue of the past. The current companion is not the author of the former pain. Yet the ancient wound insists on viewing all things through that same distorting lens. I declared that true love begins where projection ends. For as long as we cast our fears, our wounds, and our traumas onto the other, we are incapable of perceiving them as they truly are. The relationship degenerates into a field of conflict between what was and what could yet be. And rather than serving to liberate us, love becomes a source of ceaseless tension. Healing within this domain is a gradual undertaking. It demands presence, deep listening, and sincere self-scrutiny. One must inquire of oneself. Do I react to the immediate occurrence or to that which preceded it? Trust is not an act of immediate reckless immersion. It is the slow realization that safe havens exist, that not all love inflicts injury, that it is indeed possible to love without losing one's very self, and to trust without dissolving entirely. When this realization begins to dawn, the armor need not be forcibly discarded. It simply becomes superfluous. Some individuals carry the burden of the world in utter silence. They seek no assistance. They utter no lament. They expose no weakness. They are perceived as strong, resilient, the ones capable of managing any adversity. Yet frequently that formidable strength was not a deliberate choice. It was the sheer necessity imposed by absence. When no recourse was available, the soul was compelled to learn self-reliance, and it succeeded. The strength of the deeply injured possesses profound roots. It is not ostentatious, nor is it expressed in grand rhetoric or conspicuous demonstrations of confidence. It is a strength born of the sheer fatigue of repeated collapse, followed by rising again, born of the constant terror of utter breakdown and the unavoidable demand to remain upright. It is a silent strength, yet unyielding, a foundation constructed painstakingly through immense effort, suffering, and sheer tenacity. I understood that in countless instances, profound suffering ignites a spontaneous search for the self, the deepest essence of the psyche. When all external structures appear to crumble, an immutable force within insists on continuance. This force is that which sustains the soul when the ego can no longer maintain command. It is the voice that whispers persist when all evidence suggests the path has vanished. It is the self calling from the very heart of the darkness. Yet this strength, when afforded no opportunity to be tempered by human affection and care, becomes inflexible. The soul, having mastered endurance, gradually loses its capacity for surrender. It hardens, becoming armor, not solely against external men, but against its own inner life. For to display pain after a protracted and solitary effort to contain all things feels nearly like a betrayal of the journey itself. It is for this reason that authentic strength must be accompanied by vulnerability. To be strong does not signify a perennial lack of need for others. It signifies knowing when one may at last find repose in a secure presence. It signifies the ability to articulate, "I can no longer bear this," without the fear of falling apart. It signifies the conviction that strength may also assume a gentle aspect. When the soul realizes that it is no longer required to engage in perpetual combat, a new form of strength emerges. Not merely the strength of survival, but conscious strength. This is the fortitude that permits one to carry one's own history without becoming rigid within, that recognizes the deep value of every scar, yet no longer requires them as validation. And it is then that the path ceases to be solitary, even if it remains quiet. Some individuals reside more within the confines of their minds than within their bodies. They are in continuous cogitation, analyzing every gesture, mentally reenacting past dialogues, projecting endless future scenarios. Their intellect seems incapable of repose. This may initially appear to be a sign of intelligence, but it is frequently nothing more than fear disguised. Overthinking can be an elaborate mechanism for the avoidance of feeling. For those who have suffered deeply, the emotional realm may appear excessively volatile. Feeling, when inextricably bound to intense pain, becomes a palpable danger. Consequently, the ego devises a solution. It transfers the totality of experience to the rational domain. The mind becomes the sanctuary, the zone of control, the place where all things can be predicted, elucidated, and comprehended. Yet in this relentless pursuit of control, emotional spontaneity begins to atrophy. I cautioned that mere knowledge is insufficient for transformation. I stated knowing is not enough. We must live, and living necessarily entails feeling even when that feeling brings discomfort. Excessive reflection is the ego's tactic to keep suffering suspended in a theoretical ether. Yet, that which is not felt cannot be integrated, and that which remains unintegrated continues to exercise its influence from the darkness. It is commonly observed that individuals given to overanalysis struggle to articulate their emotions. They can identify the situation, expound upon the cause, and recognize the pattern, yet they remain immobilized. This is because analysis devoid of emotional acknowledgement descends into a futile loop, a continuous oscillation between intellectual understanding and psychic obstruction. The unconscious logic holds that thinking is safe, while feeling is hazardous. Yet the profound paradox is that only feeling engenders transformation. Only when the pain is processed through the body, not merely the intellect, can it finally find a place of repose. And this does not necessitate drowning in sorrow, but permitting oneself to be present with the reality of what is without seeking refuge in rational arguments. Healing does not require a cessation of thought. It necessitates the creation of space for thought to proceed alongside emotion, to permit the body to speak, to allow the tears their cause, to let silence settle, without the immediate compulsion for explanation. This process does not diminish one's strength. It simply renders one more profoundly human. When thought ceases to function as a defense mechanism and returns to its rightful role as a tool, it regains its true purpose to provide clarity, not protection. And then, by slow degrees, the soul begins to learn that feeling is not a herald of danger. It is the definitive sign of life. There exists a singular form of sensitivity that cannot be acquired. It is a direct product of suffering. Many who have endured deep affliction develop a perceptive, almost intuitive presence. They possess the capacity to listen without condemnation. They sense that which others cannot articulate. They know precisely where the injury lies because they themselves have been wounded there. These are the individuals I would designate as wounded healers. Recalling the archetype of Chiron, the centaur of Hellenic myth, who, though afflicted by an incurable wound, could yet minister to the suffering of others. Yet this remarkable capacity to soothe others does not invariably originate from a place of resolution. At times it is born from an unconscious desire to mend in another that which still bleeds within one's own self. It is an impulse of great beauty, yet fraught with peril, for it can lead to the oblivion of the self. Caring for the welfare of others becomes the primary duty, and one's own pain is indefinitely deferred. Suffering is employed as a bridge to reach the other, but never as a path back into the interior landscape. The archetype of the wounded healer is inherently ambiguous. It contains both power and vulnerability. The power to transmute personal pain into genuine sympathy, and the vulnerability of seeking refuge within the role of the caregiver. It is as though by bestowing one's presence upon others, they successfully evade confronting their own absence. It is for this precise reason that those who offer such extensive care for all others often feel a secret solitude. I understood this pervasive trap well. I knew that the psyche perpetually seeks balance, and that an excessive externalization of care can signal a profound internal neglect. When the act of consolation is accompanied by exhaustion, a suppressed irritation, or a sense of personal erasure, it is a clear indication that the archetype has fallen out of equilibrium. Healing in this context does not require the cessation of all care, but the inclusion of the self within the care. It demands the acceptance that the pain of another may touch one's own, yet must not be permitted to wholly consume it. That listening outwardly must be accompanied by an equivalent listening inwardly, and that one may be present without being compelled to shoulder every burden. The transmutation of the wound into awareness is the factor that renders the wounded healer a transformative presence, both for others and for himself. When this internal shift occurs, the act of caring ceases to be an evasion and becomes a choice not motivated by a need to rescue, but by the fact that one has learned to walk with one's own sorrow, and thus understands how to regard the sorrow of another with true reverence. Expecting less may be mistaken for prudence. Yet, it is frequently nothing more than a form of self-protection. When an individual has been repeatedly disappointed, deceived, or abandoned, the very notion of hope becomes dangerous. To cultivate expectations feels like a tremendous risk. Therefore, to avert subsequent disappointment, the soul initiates a form of internal shielding. It anticipates little, desires less, and prepares for the worst outcome. Underlying this entire strategy is a deep pain that remains unassumed. This manner of existence may feel entirely safe, yet it imposes severe limitations. For in the act of diminishing expectations to avoid pain, one simultaneously diminishes one's openness to life itself. Relationships lose their depth. Aspirations are no longer allowed to be freely imagined. Apprehension supplants excitement, and every potential joy is shadowed by the dread of subsequent loss. I have stated that the soul seeks expansion. This implies that at its fundamental core the psyche desires growth, experience, creation, and love. Yet when it has been profoundly scarred by disillusionment, it recoils not because it no longer possesses desire, but because it doubts its capacity to withstand another fall. In this particular context, low expectations are merely the symptom of one who waited for something that never materialized. It is vital to comprehend that this is not a sign of weakness. It is a defense, a specific form of emotional containment erected to safeguard psychic integrity. However, when this mechanism becomes too rigid, life begins to occur only partially. All possibilities are filtered through the dark glass of fear, and all that lies beyond one's control is perceived as a threat. The first step toward ameliorating this pattern is the attainment of awareness. It is not a call to return to naive hope, but a gradual granting of permission for hope to exist without demanding certainty. It is the realization that one may truly desire something without utterly disintegrating should it not come to fruition, and that opening one's heart does not necessitate reckless exposure, but nor does it justify the complete avoidance of communion. The recovery of hope is not naivety. It is courage. The courage to admit that despite all past adversity, one still yearns to live genuinely, even in the knowledge that life offers no guarantees. Beneath the scars, there remains a part of the self that desires to feel, to engage, to dream. For it is in that very openness, however tentative, that the soul commences its expansion once more, and with it life itself. Not all pain reaches its conclusion with the cessation of the event. Certain experiences continue to resonate within even decades afterward, not because the individual obstinately clings to suffering, but because an element of the experience was never adequately processed, never truly digested, never brought to a close. In such circumstances, the past is not merely a memory. It is an abiding presence. And to live with it clinging to one's being is akin to walking with open wounds that no one else can see. Only the carrier comprehends the true magnitude of the burden. I have emphasized that what we resist persists, and few things are resisted with the ferocity of psychological grief. Not the sorrow attending final physical death, but the sorrow for that which was perpetually withheld, the love that was ephemeral, the affection that was unreturned, the childhood that was deficient, the words that were never spoken, the potential that was never actualized. These invisible losses forge inner shackles that keep us bound to that which is gone, yet still exerts its authority over us. The ego frequently attempts to forge ahead without ever glancing backward, employing tactics of denial, minimization, and rationalization. Yet the soul moves with its own slow measure. It demands time, space, and truth. And psychological grief is only accomplished when there is sufficient room to feel without judgment, without forced explanation, without the impatient demand to be over it. The letting go of the past does not signify forgetting it. It signifies integration. It is the conscious gaze upon the event and the quiet acknowledgement. This indeed happened. It marked me deeply. It caused great suffering. And now I may permit it to find a place within me that is no longer an open wound but a recognized memory. It is not erasure. It is the transmutation of a scar into something that no longer bleeds, but which still possesses a story to impart. This process is frequently arduous, for it compels the ego to seize its pretense of perpetual well-being. It brings the soul face to face with the true nature of the loss, the one buried beneath years of avoidance. But only when that grief is given its legitimate domain can the past seize its compulsive repetition in the present. Only then do the ancient patterns relinquish their hold. Only then do former pains cease to bleed into new experiences. To strive against the past is to remain inextricably tethered to it. To genuinely release, it is a quiet, profound act of courage. It is the declaration: I accept what was, but I am no longer obliged to derive my life solely from that experience. And in that act, something dissolves, not because it ceases to exist, but because it finally finds its rightful place, a place where it may reside without seizing total control. When the work of grief is complete, the present becomes authentic and the future is finally liberated from being a mere reflection of past injury, becoming instead a genuine sphere for creation. Behind every defense mechanism lies a narrative, and beneath every narrative lies the relentless effort to persevere. The behaviors exhibited by one who has suffered profoundly are not character flaws. They are maps, responses shaped within the crucible of chaos, the silent means by which the psyche strove to endure the unbearable. I have grasped this truth deeply. I knew that suffering does not reshape us out of spite, but rather reorganizes us for the sake of survival. That which appears as coldness may be internal containment. That which is perceived as distrust may be necessary protection. That which sounds like arrogance, remoteness, or excessive rationality is often merely fear. A fear learned too early and reinforced so many times that it became an inescapable structure. It is for this reason that healing does not begin with judgment, but with listening. Not with forceful rupture, but with genuine presence. Individuation, that lifelong process of becoming the complete being one is destined to be, does not occur in spite of the pain. It occurs through it. For it is in the confrontation with that which causes the deepest hurt that we unearth the necessary truths that demand transformation. By casting light upon those facets of ourselves which we have hidden, disowned, or forgotten, we commence the arduous task of reconstructing our inner narrative toward greater wholeness. When suffering is brought into the full light of awareness, it ceases to be a blind, dragging weight and becomes instead a point of connection with our own inner depth. The wound itself does not disappear, but its prominence shifts. It ceases to occupy the central place and becomes but one part of the whole. And in that psychic rearrangement, we acquire an insight that no external theory can ever confer authentic presence in our own experience. Healing is neither a linear path nor a swift one, but it is indeed possible. It begins when we are prepared to look beneath the surface of behavior, both our own and that of others. When we realize that our fellow men are not fundamentally difficult, they are merely endeavoring to exist with the meager tools they possess precisely as we are. It is there that authentic empathy is born, and with it the potential to become more human, more complete, and more truly free. For once pain is rightly recognized, it no longer dictates our essence, it reveals it. And perhaps this is the most essential realization of all, that suffering is not the final destination, but a threshold, a summons to return to our true selves. An invitation to finally live in accordance with truth, not in resentment of what injured us, but precisely because we have chosen to face it with steadfast courage and profound awareness. I shall not detain you further in this discourse. Should these reflections have resonated with the quiet recesses of your own history, and if you perceive within them a measure of truth, then I bid you take this moment for silent consideration. Ponder what has been said and let it germinate within your soul. If you feel moved to do so, leave a brief testament beneath this text stating, "I am learning to listen to my pain." Such an avowal signals to me that you have engaged with these difficult concepts until the very close, and further, that you are prepared to transform your suffering into a guiding path. And that, my friend, is assuredly the genesis of all true too.